You've seen it happen. You fold a plastic bag too hard and this white crease just appears right along the fold line. Or you drop a polypropylene storage container on the kitchen floor, the kind you use for leftovers. And even though it doesn't shatter, there's suddenly this milky white patch spreading out from the point of impact. The plastic isn't cracked, it isn't broken, but something clearly happened to it. And if you flex it back the other way, sometimes that white patch partially disappears. I kept noticing this for years before I actually looked into why it happens. And the answer turns out to involve some genuinely fascinating physics happening at a scale you can't see. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a bent plastic bag the same way again. Let's start with what plastic actually is at the molecular level, because you can't understand stress whitening without understanding the structure underneath. Most common plastics, polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, PET, are what material scientists call thermoplastics. That word just means they can be melted and reshaped with heat, which is why they're so useful for manufacturing. But what makes them interesting at the physics level is that they're built from incredibly long chains of molecules called polymers. The word polymer literally means many parts in Greek. Take a simple molecule, ethylene for example, which is just 2 carbon atoms and 4 hydrogen atoms, and link hundreds of thousands of them together into a chain that's microscopically long. That chain is a polymer. Now imagine a bowl of cooked spaghetti. All those strands tangled together, twisted around each other, looping back on themselves. That's roughly what the inside of a piece of polyethylene looks like at the molecular scale. The polymer chains aren't perfectly organized. They're a mess, a beautiful, structurally useful mess. And the way those chains interact with each other, the way they slide, resist, and eventually fail under stress, is exactly what produces that white color. When you apply force to a thermoplastic, those tangled polymer chains start to respond. At first, the material just stretches a little, the chains move slightly, straightening out, sliding past each other in ways that are mostly reversible. Material scientists call this elastic deformation. The material bends and springs back like it forgot anything happened. But push harder, bend that bag, twist that lid, drop that container, and you cross into a different zone. The polymer chains start getting yanked out of their comfortable tangled configuration. They align, they stretch, and in some areas the stress concentrates enough that something more dramatic starts happening. In semi-crystalline thermoplastics like polypropylene and polyethylene, the material begins forming what researchers call crazes. A craze is not quite a crack, it's more like a crack that's been bridged. The polymer chains across the potential fracture site get drawn out into incredibly fine fibrils, tiny threads that still connect the 2 sides of the damage zone. The material hasn't fully separated, but the internal structure has been fundamentally changed. You've entered the territory of fracture mechanics, even if the part is technically still in one piece. Here's where the light comes in, and this is the part that directly explains what you actually see with your eyes. Unstressed plastic is largely transparent or translucent because its internal structure is fairly uniform. Light passes through without bouncing around much, but when crazes form, you suddenly have a region full of tiny voids, gaps between those polymer fibrils, interspersed with dense fibril strands. The size of these features, typically somewhere between 10 and 100 nanometers, puts them right in the range where they interact strongly with visible light wavelengths. What happens when light hits a zone full of structures at that scale? It scatters. The refractive index, the measure of how much light bends passing through a material, is different inside the fibrils than in the surrounding voids, and that difference sends light bouncing off in all directions. When light scatters equally across a broad spectrum of wavelengths, the material looks white. It's the same basic reason clouds are white, and why milk is white, and why ground glass looks white instead of clear. It's not a pigment, it's not a stain, it's a structural effect. The material hasn't changed its chemistry, it's changed its geometry at the nanoscale. This is what stress whitening actually is, and once you see it that way, it makes complete sense. Now, companies have known about this problem for a long time. DuPont researchers were already trying to understand why certain polymer films in molded parts were developing these white patches during manufacturing back in the 1960s. By the 1970s, it had become a serious area of study within polymer science and material science more broadly, because stress whitening isn't just cosmetically annoying, it's often an early warning sign that a part is approaching mechanical failure. There are actually two different mechanisms that produce stress whitening, and they show up in different types of plastic. The first is that crazing we just talked about. The second is called shear banding. In shear banding, instead of forming crack-like crazes, the thermoplastic develops thin bands where the polymer chains have been intensely aligned and densified. These bands have a slightly different refractive index than the surrounding material, and that difference also scatters light and produces visible whitening. Shear banding is more common in amorphous thermoplastics like polystyrene and certain grades of ABS, which incidentally is the material used in Lego bricks. The distinction matters in practice. Crazing can be a direct precursor to complete fracture through fracture mechanics. Those fibrils can eventually snap under sustained load. Shear banding, on the other hand, often represents a kind of deformation that actually redistributes stress across the material and can make it locally tougher in the short term. So if stress whitening is such a persistent problem, why haven't manufacturers just fixed it? The honest answer is that they've been working on it for decades, and the solutions involve real trade-offs that aren't always obvious. One approach is to add rubber particles to the polymer matrix. This is exactly what's done in high-impact polystyrene, HIPS, and in ABS plastic. The rubber particles act as stress concentrators that trigger many tiny crazes simultaneously, spreading the damage over a large volume instead of letting it concentrate in one spot. The result is a thermoplastic that can absorb a lot of energy before fracturing, but it still whitens because you've actually increased the total amount of crazing. You've just made it more controlled and distributed. Another approach involves controlling the crystalline structure of the polymer more carefully. In semi-crystalline thermoplastics like polypropylene and polyethylene, stress whitening is strongly affected by the size and arrangement of crystalline regions within the material. Smaller, more uniform crystallites tend to produce less light scattering because the scale of the features is different. In 2019, researchers at Borealis, one of the major European polyolefin producers, published data on nucleated polypropylene formulations that showed measurable reductions in stress whitening while maintaining impact resistance. It's not a fully solved problem in materials science, but each generation of polymer engineering gets closer. Now back to that question of reversibility, because it's one of the more counterintuitive things about stress whitening and one I find genuinely interesting. Sometimes if you relax the stress, you put the plastic bag back to its original shape, the white patch fades, not always completely, but noticeably. Why, in the case of shear banding, the alignment that caused the whitening can partially relax if the polymer chains have enough mobility. This depends heavily on something called the glass transition temperature, the point below which the chains are essentially frozen and can't rearrange, and above which there's enough thermal energy for them to drift back toward a more disordered state. Many flexible thermoplastics, including most polyethylene products, are already above their glass transition temperature at normal room temperature. So the chains can wiggle back, the light scattering geometry shifts, the white fades, crazes are less reversible. Once those polymer fibrils have formed across a craze zone, they don't simply unform when the stress is removed, but even crazes can appear to fade somewhat because the void geometry changes when the load is released. The fibrils relax slightly, the scattering characteristics shift, and the white becomes less vivid. The materials that show the most dramatic reversible stress whitening are thermoplastic elastomers, very flexible rubber-like polymers, where chain mobility is high at room temperature. Some of the soft touch grips and flexible packaging made from these materials can produce striking white marks that almost completely disappear once the stress is gone. There's one last thing worth knowing, because it connects all of this polymer physics to something with real engineering consequences. In product design and quality control, stress whitening is used as a diagnostic tool. When an engineer is drop testing a new plastic housing, a laptop case, a car interior panel, a medical device, stress whitening during impact tells them exactly where the stress concentrated in the structure, which regions deformed most, where the fracture mechanics are most concerning for long-term durability. Some testing protocols use stress whitening as a literal pass/fail criterion. If a part whitens too readily under a specified load, it fails the test even without cracking, because the whitening indicates the material has been pushed into a damage regime that could compromise performance over time. This is why cheaper plastic products stress whiten so much more easily than better made ones. Higher quality polymer formulations, better crystalline structure control, rubber toughening additives, all of these things push the onset of stress whitening to higher stress levels. That white mark appearing too easily is genuinely a quality signal. It's the material telling you something about itself. So the next time you fold a plastic bag and see that white crease appear, you're watching polymer physics happen in real time. Those long tangled chains of polyethylene molecules are being yanked out of their comfortable disordered state, forming crazes full of tiny voids and fibrils that scatter light in every direction and produce that white color. It's not a dye, it's not damage in the way a scratch is damage. It's the internal geometry of the thermoplastic itself changing at a scale 100 times smaller than a human hair. And whether that change reverses when you relax the stress or stays there permanently depends on the specific polymer, its temperature, and how far into the damage zone the material was pushed. Here's what I'm curious about. Have you ever noticed stress whitening on a product and then realized later it was the spot where the thing eventually broke? Or have you seen it fade and wondered if the plastic had somehow healed itself? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely like to know what materials people are running into this on. If you got something out of this, subscribing actually helps a lot. There's a lot more physics hiding inside everyday objects, and we're going to keep pulling it apart.